Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to begin with the portion of this series that deals with the phases of the French Revolution. There's going to be many. There's going to be a lot of detail in each one because the revolution is fast-paced and it moves from a very sort of banal, almost aristocratic resurgence to a liberal revolution to increasing phases of radicalism, the Reign of Terror, through the reactionary movements of the Directory, and then, of course, Napoleon at the end of the revolutionary phase. But this segment is really going to look at really just the summer and fall of 1789 and what we might call the Liberal Revolution. So what happens when the Estates General becomes deadlocked? Um, we saw in the last segment the problems with voting in the estates, the doubling of the estate. All of these issues are just lead to gridlock in the meetings. No resolution can be met. Um, so the so the delegates, particularly in the Third Estate, begin to take matters into their own hand. Now, for all intents and purposes, most people regard what happens as a historical accident, that there was a keeper of the keys who did not unlock the meeting room for the Third Estate. And members of the Third Estate felt that as they were locked out of their meeting room, that this was the signal of the end, that their proceedings were seen as being too bellicose, that royal authorities were going to clamp down on them, and they got a little bit nervous, and angry for that matter. So they go to an indoor squash court, tennis court, commonly called a tennis court, and there they are joined by members of the First and Second Estate, the lesser nobles and the poorer clergy. And since essentially in this one meeting room, all of the various parts of French society were essentially in one place, they say, well, this is truly representative of all of France. It's the Third Estate, it's the members of the clergy, it's the members of the nobility. Everyone is here, and so therefore, this is representative of the nation of France, and so they dub themselves the National Assembly. They reject the nature of the Third Estate. They say that's just abolished. We don't want to participate in that anymore. We have this new National Assembly, and they swear an oath while they're there, because of the room that they're in. It's called the Tennis Court Oath, that they would not stop meeting until France had a constitution, and France was therefore transformed into a constitutional monarchy. The aristocracy, the upper aristocracy, who had hoped at the meeting of the Third Estate, the meeting of the Estates General, would trigger an aristocratic reaction, instead found themselves now in a situation where they were very much allied with the clergy, trying to stop this from happening. This was now the beginning of a liberal revolution. It was dominated by the bourgeoisie, those folks who had sort of imbibed over the course of the 18th century the ideals and the Enlightenment, and these are the folks that are going to carry those Enlightenment ideals through to a transformation of the French political life and the French economy. Louis XVI and his allies in the nobility call out the army, and so slowly the military begins to form both in and around the capital and in Versailles, which is about 18 miles outside of Paris. On July 11th, Louis XVI dismisses the minister, the very popular, and when I say popular, popular among the lower orders in French society, the Swiss banker financier Jacques Necker. Necker was the one who had proposed eventually that the Estates General would have to be called. Louis feels that Necker can no longer manage the situation. He dismisses him. This causes great consternation in Paris. They adore him. They're already angry because of the high prices of bread. So their protests begin to take on an even more militant dimension. They hear of the events that are going on out at Versailles. They sense that the military is mobilizing, and so the Paris mobs take matters into their own hands and surround and eventually storm the famous or infamous Bastille prison. Their goal, and the Bastille was which no longer exists in Paris today. There's a district named Bastille, but the actual prison itself was dismantled during the Revolution. Um, the Bastille was kind of a symbol of the authoritarian power of the regime. And so to attack it was some would regard as to attack the monarchy itself. Their goal is to acquire arms and ammunition, which are located in the Bastille. There are very few prisoners there. They take control of the prison. They murder, uh, vigilante murder, the gaoler, the commandant of the prison, put his head on the pike, and they appoint the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of the American Revolutionary War, as the leader of a new National Guard, in effect, a new army for France that was designed to protect the people of France, so not so much as the old military, which was designed to protect the monarch and to protect the state. Different dimension we have going on here. This is a sense now. It's very sort of Rousseau. It's the people uh, in which sovereignty resides. It's a very Rousseauian idea there. And so, therefore, it's the guard of the nation, not the guard of the state. It's like saying Louis is Louis the king of France, or is he the king of the French? It gets to that philosophical question of wherein power, wherein authority, wherein sovereignty lies. And clearly, by calling it the National Guard, there's a sense that this sovereignty and the authority for this military force is with the people, and not so much, um, the government, shall we say? Regardless of how we can interpret that, the storming of the Bastille is definitely the first major radicalization of the French Revolution, and we will see mobs, Parisian mobs in particular, consistently radicalized the French Revolution over time. Um, Folks feel that things aren't going well. They go to the streets. There's a shall we say, a leftward movement of the revolution. It's at this point now that we could say that a revolution truly begins, and it spreads very quickly. So in Paris, you have this kind of anti-government liberal agenda. It spreads to the countryside, what's called the Great Fear. Out in the countryside, though, something very different is happening. Peasants are attacking nobles in their chateaus. Now, this isn't to remove the nobility. It's actually to turn back some of the changes that the early modern period, in particular the enclosure movement, the aggrandizement of large estates, created in rural France. These peasants are more interested in restoring their old feudal privileges than they are in getting rid of the nobility in general. They want the protections that they had during the Middle Ages, and that's why instead of destroying the chateau and taking off all of its goods and enriching themselves and doing all those sorts of things, redistributing wealth, they're going after the scriptura in those chateaus, in those rooms where the nobility is keeping their records, tax records, tenancy records, all those things. They're destroying those because that information is power for the nobility, and the peasantry wants to turn back all of those legal changes that had been made as the Middle Ages closed. So the peasantry has a very different agenda in the Great Fear, because what's happening in Versailles, though, is not a restoration of old feudal privileges and privileges for the peasantry, but in fact the end of feudalism. On August 4th, the National Assembly votes to end all feudal dues, to end all class distinctions, and therefore creates equity under the law for everyone in French society, especially with regards to taxation. No one is going to be above the law. No one is going to be in a special privileged class when it comes to taxes. As well, they also go after the urban guild system. So all those mercantile claims of monopoly and rights and privileges and so forth the guilds had enjoyed from the Middle Ages and were reinforced by mercantilist policies under the early absolutist monarchs, all of that has ended as well. Again, this is all part of that liberal agenda to create equality under the law and to promote individual personal economic freedom. Shortly after that, by the end of that month, we see, right, the speed at which this is moving. The first thing that the revolutionaries decide that before you even get to a constitution, you need to enumerate what the rights of French citizens are. And so they publish the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It is influenced by, as you see here, by the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. They felt that it was more important to do this first. In part, that was a response to some of the issues that were raised by the delegates to the American Constitutional Convention. Okay? Many, like Thomas Jefferson, who felt that it was that the Constitution was putting the cart before the horse, that American rights should be enumerated first before the government framework was set up. So the French decided to go with their Declaration of Rights first. And what that does is establishes a blueprint for French law. And so some of the lines that we see from here are directly from Enlightenment principles of liberalism. Men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. Right? That goes back to Rousseau's sense of equality. Rousseau's sense of the general will. Law is the expression of the general will, the will of the people. Taxes can only be raised with popular consent. Separation of powers, that idea from Montesquieu, is included in there. Freedom of religious expression, as opposed to the dominance of the church. And interestingly enough, there's freedom from oppression. So there's some interesting elements in the French Declaration of Rights that are different from, let's say, the American or the English model, in which specific rights are enumerated. The French tend to have these sort of very broad-based, concepts, these more general statements in their constitution. That is in part because we have to understand that effectively they're starting from scratch. They're establishing this Declaration of the Rights at the beginning of a revolutionary period in which there was no real development of any kind of representative government, really, in the French polity prior to this time. The English Bill of Rights was the capstone of a series of conflicts over the 17th century, the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. The Bill of Rights sets in stone all of the ideological battles that had been won over that time period. The American Bill of Rights played very much on the earlier English precedent and also addressed specifically those abuses that the British government had, or in the eyes of the colonists, those abuses of law that the British had engaged in that were not going to happen in the new American state. So they were very, shall we say, retrospective, the English and American Bill of Rights. The French Bill of Rights is Declaration of Rights is looking forward to framing a new constitution and a new polity for the French state. Much of what goes on in Paris at this time also has an impact in terms of expressing popular support for the meetings at Versailles. Okay. Louis stalled. Louis was foot dragging, and this was clear, at least to the folks in Paris, what his intentions were, that he was attempting to rally anti-revolutionary support. It was dangerous for the king to be so far outside of the city. Again, French kings had always sort of stayed outside of Paris because Paris had a reputation, going back to the Fronde in the 1640s, of being a problem for French monarchs. So, about 7,000 Parisian women in the fall of 1789 set out for Versailles, and their goal is to bring the king and the royal family themselves back to Paris. And they are successful. They effectively cut off the king from military support. They actually get into Versailles. They're not too fond of Marie Antoinette. They'd love to have her head on a pike. But their goal is to bring the monarch back, and they do. And really, from that point forward, except for Louis's attempt to escape to Varennes, from that point forward, the monarchy really becomes imprisoned in Paris. And now the constitutional elements and the more radical elements of the French Revolution will begin. But we'll save that now for a later lecture. We'll look at the beginnings of the constitutional monarchy, how Louis does not like to be a constitutional monarch, and how the constitutional monarchy, as a result of his obstructionism, how the constitutional monarchy collapses and a republic is declared. We'll save that, however, for another lecture. For now, however, thank you very much for listening.